Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. Welcome to my first sewing tutorial on this channel. Originally, I planned on this video being the first video on my YouTube channel rather than the video that you did see, which was my Halloween tree video, but I figured that it was better for you to see me making my Halloween costume on Halloween rather than seeing it as the first video like I planned. So starting off, I'm not very good at tutorials. I don't think I'm very great at giving instructions in general, and so that is why I have titled this video How I Made My Halloween Costume rather than Lydia Broadway Costume Tutorial. I tried to include as much instruction and video footage as I could from me making this costume, but things happen. So let's start with how I made my costume. So a lot of research went into making this costume. I definitely found that there were a lot of layers to Lydia's costume in the Broadway version of the show, and specifically I was making her first curtain call during the first week of the show because that version of the dress is different than the one that she wears throughout the entirety of the show. That one is definitely more bedazzled, if you will, rather than just the normal lace that she wears during the show. And so I used that as my basis more than anything else. I noticed that the dress had an underlayer to it, and I couldn't tell whether or not the underlayer was lavender or cream, and I have seen so many different cosplayers use cream underneath their dresses, and for some reason it just, to me, it didn't look right. I don't know if maybe it was the layering, but the cream just came out a little too strong in my opinion. It made the dress look like a very dull brown tannish color rather than an actual black like how it's supposed to come across. And so I decided to choose a silk polyester blend that was lavender in color rather than cream. However, I do not suggest using this blend of fabric. It was horrible to cut and to work with. It has to be the worst fabric I have ever used in my life for any costume or clothing item that I have ever made. At some point, I do plan on remaking this dress a couple of months in the future, most likely this next upcoming year, but I probably am going to use a different base fabric for the base layer because honestly, this fabric was just horrible. I highly suggest that if you plan on making this dress yourself, and if you are trying to follow along with my tutorial, that you definitely use some kind of cotton blend underneath. I can guarantee you it will be a lot easier to work with. The reason why this fabric was so difficult to work with was because the way it stretched made it very difficult to sew all the different layers on top of, but it also was a very difficult fabric to cut. And unless you had brand new fabric scissors, which, let's face it, nobody really has, you might find yourself struggling to cut this, as you have most likely seen in the footage of me cutting this particular fabric. It took a good couple of tries before I finally was able to even cut out all of my pieces. So I cut out all of my pattern pieces, and for my pattern, I ended up using a vintage day dress PDF pattern that I bought off of Etsy. For the bodice, the pattern wasn't that bad, but I ended up running into a lot of issues with the skirt, which you will see later. I pinned the two bodice pieces together so that way I had one piece to work with. I thought I had filmed myself cutting out the original skirt pattern that I had planned, but as it turns out, I really didn't. I had originally intended to cut out a circle skirt because, hey, circle skirts are easy and I've worked with circle skirts before, but vertical stripes on a circle skirt are not the best option. Lydia's dress in the show is made up of various lace stripes that go down her dress. So I ended up finding this really amazing striped fabric at my local fabric store that was on the clearance section, And because it was in the clearance section, I decided to buy a ton of it because I couldn't guarantee that it was going to be there again if I needed more. The fabric really reminded me of Tim Burton, and so I knew it was absolutely perfect for this project. I cut the fabric apart to make it a little bit easier to work with. However, this proved to be a very delicate process because it took me 3 days in order to cut everything out. I used the solid stripes to make a diagonally striped fabric. I couldn't find one that I was happy with, and so I decided to make my own. This, however, proved to waste a ton of time because it took me about a week to place, pin, and sew all of the diagonal stripes into place. If you choose fabric similar to mine for your Lydia dress, then expect about 70% of the work to actually be cutting out the individual stripes for the dress. It seriously took me 2 weeks before I could actually work on the understructure of the dress. I also found a polka dot mesh that I would use for the sleeves, more stripes, and for the collar of the dress. I did not have a pattern for the polka dot collar piece on the dress, so I ended up just making my own using a shirt that had a similar shape to it on the top, and I just traced it onto a piece of paper and made a pattern using that. I took this pattern and cut out 2 pieces of my polka dot fabric. You'll notice that I made one piece slightly longer than the other, and that is because the back portion of this particular bodice collar piece dips down lower in the back than it does in the front. Once I had both pieces cut out, I took them to my sewing machine and I cut diagonal stripes connecting every other row of polka dots in order to create a diamond pattern, and I made sure that there was a dot in the middle of each diamond pattern, which is similar to how it is in the show. However, I noticed that the diamond pattern isn't as neat in the Broadway version of the costume as how it is in my version, but I like symmetry. I noticed in looking at reference pictures that there seems to be a holographic panel on the front bodice portion of the dress, and so I found this purple holographic mesh that I decided to use underneath the front bodice portion as underneath the beading. I also ended up using this underneath the square triangle, the triangle portion of the skirt as well, since I noticed that that portion of the skirt had that sort of effect on it as well. I couldn't tell what kind of lace was used on the front portion of her skirt, so I kind of made a guess and I found this really pretty floral black lace fabric that I ended up using for the front panel of the skirt. And so, like with the holographic fabric, I kind of cut out a general shape of what I knew was going to go on the skirt and set those aside for later. Now this next part is something that I highly, highly regret doing and do not suggest any of you doing out there. I found this really amazing black mesh fabric at my local fabric store that when you looked at it was black, but when you turned it around in the light, it had a sort of purpley undertone to it that added an extra layer of dimension underneath the layers of lace that I was going to be putting it under. It looked amazing in all of my test fabrics and everything. The only issue is that my fabric store ran out of it before I could get enough of it. And so I ended up making half of the dress with this very pretty color changing fabric underneath and the other half without it. So this is something to where I definitely regret. I wish I had just bought a bunch of black mesh rather than this color changing metallic mesh. And so definitely when I do this project again, I plan on just buying regular black mesh. I don't plan on buying any specialty mesh. If you're able to find a specialty mesh that you definitely like, I suggest buying way more than you think you will need for it, because you could always use it in a different project down the line, and you can always be assured that you bought enough for your project, because I definitely didn't, and it ended up turning into an emergency. The good news is though, is that I had enough to finish the skirt. I just didn't have enough to be able to do the bodice. And I ended up having to use a black mesh that was plain for the bodice, and it resulted in a slight color difference between the bodice and the skirt. For the sleeves, I made my own pattern using the lovely Montoya Mayo's tutorial. She had a tutorial on how to create bishop sleeves, and so I used her tutorial to create a more subtle bishop sleeve for my Lydia costume, only because I noticed that Lydia's costume seemed to have a slight puff at the ends of her sleeves versus it just being straight. And so that is the route that I decided to go with. So if you're interested in learning on how to make your own bishop sleeves for your own Lydia costume or any other projects, I've left a link down below so that you can definitely check out Montoya Mayo's channel, as well as all of her other amazing tutorials. To make stripes out of my polka dot mesh, I approximated about 3 inches wide stripes, and I then cut them up, and I cut more than I thought that I would need. And definitely I ran into the same issue to where I have more fabric than I know what to do with, and I have enough fabric to make this dress 3 times over if I so wanted. Back to the bodice, I pinned the 2 back pieces to the 1 front piece in order to pretty much have the bodice be almost fully sewn together, to have 1 piece for me to work with. I did leave the back seam completely open, however, because I do plan on adding a zipper later on. To start the skirt, I sewed 2 of the panel pieces together so that way I would have 1 piece to work with, and I could hide the center seam underneath the decorative panel that I was going to put into place. I then cut out a semi-triangle shape out of my holographic fabric and my floral lace fabric, and I placed it over the seam so that way everything was hidden. Once those were sewn on, I started to layer my black mesh over the purple fabric until I got the level of darkness that I was happy with. Even though it was clear that the underlayer of the dress was more of a purple tone, the overall effect of the dress was that it was supposed to be a black dress. And so I played around with layering the mesh fabrics and the lace in different ways in order to get a level of darkness that still came across as lavender in certain lights, and then, but more importantly, it looked like a black dress when looked at from a distance or looked at with a quick glance. Once I was happy with how the layers were supposed to look, I began to sew each layer together before adding the lace stripes. For the lace stripes, I ended up sewing them on one at a time. I just alternated the pattern just a little bit to make sure that it all looked, in a way, kind of random, but still well thought out and planned. I repeated this pattern onto the 3rd panel and then sewed the 3rd panel onto the connected 2-piece panel. I did not sew the final seam completely together on the panel yet. I left it completely flat for the skirt, simply because there is still some detail that needs to be done on the skirt before I could fully sew it together. I found some faux leather trim that was perfect to use on the decorative center panel as well as to hide the seams. I also used a thin black bias tape in order to help hide the seams and add a further decorative and finished element to the skirt on all of the seams in between the individual stripes. I took the bodice panel of the holographic fabric, pinned it, and sewed it down. I then cut out a layer of the black mesh fabric in the shape of the entirety of the bodice, so that way I had one big piece to work with rather than a bunch of individual little pieces. I then proceeded to sew it into place. From now on, the instructions kind of start getting repetitive, which is pin in place, sew in place, pin in place, sew in place. So instead of outright saying it, I'm just going to assume that you are able to follow the process at this point. The holographic portion of the bodice only needed one layer of the black mesh, while the rest of the bodice needed 2 layers of it. So I added the second layer to the rest of the bodice and cut around the holographic portions in order to make sure that it wasn't double layered in any way. Like the skirt, the seams of the bodice will be covered later on, and so you don't need to worry about them being perfect. I then proceeded to add the black polka dot mesh collar onto the front of the bodice. I didn't add the back piece yet though, because there is going to be extra work needed for the back panel piece. I then began to add the stripes the same way that I did as the skirt, along with the leather trim and the bias tape trim in order to hide all of the seams. For the back piece, I pinned the collar to the bodice and cut down the bodice fabric until it was low enough. Once pinned down, I then cut it down the center in order to make a seam where I could add the zipper later on, and then sew the 2 now individual pieces to the back of the bodice. The bodice is now practically done, but there's still a few more details that we need to add before we can fully finish it. So the curtain call version of the dress has a lot of intricate beading on the bodice, and I had a lot of difficulty figuring out what the shape was supposed to be. It wasn't until a friend of mine pointed out that it looked more like an abstract butterfly than anything else that I realized that I could probably get away with doing an abstract butterfly type of pattern and have it still give off the same appearance. So I went through this entire thing of making my own pattern piece, my own stencil and everything, only to A, have it not work out, and B, be so stressed about it that I ended up not filming it anyways. I did take photos of my process so that way you guys could kind of see what I was doing. I first made a stencil out of plain black thread so that way I could have some kind of pattern to follow when adding the beads. However, most of it was just guesswork and trying to get both sides even. I knew the general shape that I wanted it to be in, and I just added the beads as I went. And working on it was so sporadic, it took me about a week in between everything else going on in my life for me to be able to add all of the beads. But I do have to say that the final product was very much worth it, and I'm very happy that I ended up doing it. I hemmed the skirt and added 2 layers of trim 1/3 of the way up from the hem. The first was a frilled lace trim, and then I added a sequin trim in the center of the other to give it more sparkle. I definitely chose to make this version of the costume simply because it was sparkly. Because if my costumes are not extra, then what is the point? For the belt, I used a thick cotton fabric with a distressed dye design. I measured my waist and added 4 inches for seam allowance and to make sure it would fit over the dress. I added the 4 inches later because I realized that doing my exact waist measurement didn't exactly help it fit, especially with all the layers of fabric that were going onto this dress, as well as the fact that I needed the belt to overlap with itself in order to be able to snap shut. So I ended up having to cut out a 4-inch panel that I then sewed together to the existing belt, and I then covered it up by using decorations. In my reference photos, I noticed that there was a layer of lace on the bottom of the belt, and so I found this very beautiful spiderweb looking lace on Etsy, and I ordered some of it in order to add to the bottom of my belt. For the closures on the belt, they're not very visible on the costume. My guess is that they are actually sewn onto the costume and the entire thing just zips up to make things easier. However, I'm not making things easier on myself. So I hid 3 snap buttons on the inside of the belt so that it would snap on and off and the seam would be barely visible. Instead of hand sewing more beading onto the belt, I found a pair of amazing and beautiful beaded appliques on Etsy, and I ordered them, hand sewed them on, and then placed a black and white cameo in the center as what her original belt in the show looks like. For the sleeves, there is an abstract design on the original costume. Once I had the design, I began to add the lace. First, I added the scalloped lace along the hem of the sleeve. As you can see here, I finished one sleeve first to make sure the design worked before filming me doing the second sleeve. The first line of lace is meant to hide the elastic that will cinch the sleeve to the wrist. Sew along the length of the lace, leaving each of the ends open so that you can slip the elastic through later. The rest of the lace is purely decorative, and I followed the design you saw pictured just a moment ago. Like the bodice and the skirt, I'm not sewing the sleeves fully together yet because the last detail on all of these pieces are the Swarovski crystal details on the dress. If you've watched the curtain calls during this time when this dress was used, you can see that there are definitely a bunch of Swarovski crystals sparkling in the stage lighting as Lydia takes her bow. So I decided to do that as well. Before adding the rhinestones, I went ahead and darted the bodice so that way it would be more fitted and I wouldn't have to risk sewing over rhinestones. To make finishing the bodice easier, I also sewed the top shoulder seams together. I hemmed the collared portion and added the same scalloped lace that was on the hem of the sleeves. It was at this point that I was tired, I was rushing, and I just wanted to get this thing done that I realized I forgot an important detail. When you look at the original pictures of Lydia's costume, you will notice that the diagonal striped fabric on the skirt goes lower than the hem of the dress, resulting in this diagonal fringe. And so I ended up having to cut off little 2 to 3 inch pieces of my diagonal lace in order to add to the bottom of the skirt so that way it would have the same fringe effect. I also forgot to add the scalloped lace portion to the front floral panel portion of the skirt, and I went ahead and took the time to do that as well. Now it is finally time to add the rhinestones. I used 3 different colors of Swarovski crystals that you can find online on craft stores on Etsy as well as eBay and other places, and I used E6000 glue in order to attach them to the fabric because it has to be probably one of the most reliable fabric glues I have ever used when adding any kind of rhinestone to a costume. I placed the rhinestones only on the polka dot stripe since that seems to be where they are on the original costume. I proceeded to do the same thing on both the sleeves and the bodice, leaving all of them flat and unsewn together so that way I didn't have to worry about the rhinestones shifting as the glue dried. To finish the bodice, I added a black ruffle collar to the seam where the bodice met the collar. I was genuinely scared that this amount of fabric wouldn't fit through my sewing machine, but thankfully it glided through like butter. There's also some extra lace that is on the top of this ruffle bit of collar, and I searched everywhere to find a lace that looked like it. Wasn't happy with any of the results I found, and after about 4 days of searching endlessly through Etsy shops, I actually found the exact same lace that they used on the actual Lydia costume, which blew my mind. Now it is time to finish the sleeves. I worked a piece of elastic the length of my wrist with seam allowance through the lace chamber I made for it. I then proceeded to sew the sleeves fully together. For the skirt, I sewed the 2 sides together and made 2 parallel stitches at the top of the waist. This stitch allowed me to gather the skirt down to my waist size and prepare it for sewing to the bodice. You can't see it here, but I have placed the bodice right side out into the skirt in order to sew the 2 together. Once that was done, I flipped the entire piece right side out to add the zipper and the sleeves. Here you will see me prepare the dress for adding the zipper and me struggling to put the sleeves on. I don't know why this particular part of the project was so difficult for me. I have put zippers and sleeves onto multiple projects before, but for some reason this zipper was nearly impossible for me to put in, and these sleeves did not go in without a fight. They kept bundling up in funny ways that resulted in me having to use a seam ripper, rip the entire sleeves out, and then try pinning them and sewing them in again. And this went on for a matter of days that I struggled with these 2 parts of the costume. As such, I ended up not filming any of it really. And the parts that I did end up filming were nothing much to show for. So, in order to make up for my lack, I decided to add links down to sewing in zippers and sewing in sleeves into the description box to make up for the lack of footage in this video of me doing those exact 2 things. Now that the dress is pretty much done, let's talk about the accessories that go with it. I was just as excited as I was when I found that same exact place to find the same exact pair of tights that were used for the girls who played Lydia online. I actually found them on Walmart of all places, and so I ordered them. They're extremely comfortable. I also ended up buying my wig from UV Me Wigs. I've bought from them before, and they're actually pretty good quality for the lower price range, and so I was definitely very happy to go ahead and buy one of their wigs for this costume. I also bought a tattoo choker necklace, a pair of lace gloves, and a pair of high-heeled combat boots. I know in the original show, I think she uses Doc Martens as her shoes in the show, and they're decorated with a bunch of safety pins, but I'm not the biggest fan of Doc Martens. I had a pair of Doc Martens when I was younger, and I just did not find them comfortable at all. No matter how much I tried to break those shoes in, I just couldn't. so I decided against paying the price of trying to buy a pair of Doc Martens shoes for this costume. So what I ended up doing was I found a pair of heeled combat boots that I liked the shape of and that I figured would still work for Lydia, and I changed the laces out from the black and yellow color to a purple, and then I decorated the laces with the same kind of large safety pins that are shown on her shoes in the show. I also added said safety pins to the lace on her collar. So overall, I'm actually really happy with how this turned out. Of course, there are a few things that I would change in my next iteration of the dress that I plan on making, mainly in the skirt. As you saw in my little reveal scene, the skirt is definitely a bit tighter. It's not flowy, and it's definitely not the flowy A-line shape that Lydia's dress in the show actually is. But all in all, for Halloween, I'm actually very happy and satisfied with this. It turned out beautiful and better than I could have ever imagined. So I hope you all enjoyed this video. Please leave a like, comment, and subscribe. Thank you all for watching, and have a happy and wonderful Halloween. Bye!